Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for coming today for this very important occasion in the life of the university. It's such an honor to be with all of you to join in this celebration of exceptional members of our faculty, individuals who, through their scholarship, teaching, or service, or all three, have shown to be leaders and best. And we're incredibly proud of them and all they have accomplished, and we get to hear from them about their scholarship. I'd especially like to thank my partner in leadership, Lori McCauley, our Provost and Executive Vice President for Academic Affairs, for joining us, as well as our moderator, Michael Solomon, who serves as the Dean and Vice Provost for Academic Affairs at the Rackham Graduate School. Most of all, I'd like to thank our three distinguished awardees, Professor Webb Keane, Professor Peggy McCracken, and Professor Kamal Sarabandi. These three outstanding members of our faculty come from a spectrum of fields: sociocultural and linguistic anthropology, humanism and medieval studies, and engineering and remote sensing. Yet they are united by the same values that bring us together as a community: a deep and relentless curiosity, a relentless pursuit of knowledge and understanding, and an unwavering commitment to education, scholarly excellence, and societal impact. These three distinguished professors, like so many of you across our university, are scholars and experts, educators and mentors, servants and leaders. Together, they are uplifting our university and the many students that they mentor. They are providing a vital education to the next generation of our students. And even more, they are impacting our state and shaping our nation. Together, they are demonstrating why the University of Michigan is such an exceptional place of research and education, and an inspiration to institutions around the world. Thank you again, all of you, for joining today, and congratulations again to our three distinguished professors. Now it's my privilege to invite Provost Lori McCauley to the podium to introduce our first lecture. Provost McCauley.
Thank you, President Ono. And how fortunate are we to have such distinguished colleagues and to be able to celebrate them in this way. My welcome to all of you here today, faculty, staff, students, and everyone joining us online. It is my pleasure to introduce you to the distinguished university professors whose insights are sure to leave us with a lasting impression. The first lecture belongs to Webb Keane, the George Herbert Mead Distinguished University Professor of Anthropology in the College of Literature, Sciences, and the Arts. Professor Keane is a socio-cultural and linguistic anthropologist. Originally trained as an artist at Yale, he did field work in Indonesia and received his PhD from the University of Chicago. He taught at Penn before moving to Michigan in 1998. His 4 books and other writings range over social theory, semiotics, language, religion, and ethics. Professor Keane is one of the world's leading scholars of religion, language, and moral systems. He asks how people navigate ethical challenges, and he questions how our cultural experiences and ideological commitments influence what we observe and how we describe other people's philosophies and ideologies. His extensive research and writings have been widely recognized. At every stage of his career, he's received nearly all of the high honors available to an anthropologist. He's frequently asked to give named lectures throughout the world. He's received fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences, and the Institute for Advanced Study, and has served as a visiting professor at the London School of Economics, the University of Oslo, the School of Criticism and Theory at Cornell, and is a fellow commoner of Trinity College, Cambridge. His timely lecture concerns the moral problems that arise when humans interact with near humans or quasi-humans, such as animals, robots, artificial intelligence, and self-driving vehicles. I would now like to invite Professor Keane to the podium to deliver his lecture, How We Interact with Animals, Robots, Gods, and AI. Professor Keane, the stage is yours.
Thank you, President Ono, and thank you, President Ono. Now, wait, is that working now? Thank, and Provost McCauley. It is a true honor to be here today, but it's certainly not one that I can claim for myself alone. No one does their work alone, and this is especially true of scholars. However original we take our work to be, and our research and writing to be, we're always channeling and responding to a host of other voices. The fact that our thought always emerges out of a larger dialogue is one of the key insights that George Herbert Mead stressed. My own work takes inspiration from Mead's insistence that our sense of self is never something that stands all on its own, but is shaped in very deep ways through our social interactions with other people. Teaching at Michigan in the 1890s, Mead became close with another young professor here, John Dewey, who was just starting his career as philosopher, educational reformer, and proponent of liberal democracy. Both were influenced by the philosophical pragmatism of people like William James, with its emphasis on the ways in which theoretical concepts should not be content with speculation, but can have a real impact on the world, and that impact in turn will shape their thought. From this beginning at Michigan, Mead and Dewey forged a pathway from the pragmatism of the philosophers to the empirical social sciences. Along the way, Mead became a friend and supporter of Jane Addams in her work as a social reformer, institution builder, and pioneering social worker. I follow Mead's insistence that practical endeavors, good social science, and good social theory are most fruitful when each learns from the others. In my case, that dialogue takes shape with an enormous amount of institutional support. I'm especially grateful to the unwavering support of the University of Michigan over the last quarter century. It has been a true intellectual home. I'm especially lucky to have found myself in such an extraordinary department of anthropology. And really, in all seriousness, how many academics do you know who will walk out of a faculty meeting and say to themselves, what a fantastic group of people. I'm really glad to be here. And I've thought, well, I'm just weird. Colleagues say the same thing. So it's not just me. It's a great department and a great collection of people. I want to remember my good fortune in having so many inspiring teachers and mentors over the years. And it's crucial that I've benefited from the constant poking, prodding, and pricking of students. And here you can see some of what they've come up with themselves. Although I cannot take credit for their accomplishments, they make me enormously proud. And above all, I depend on the love and the poking and the prodding and the pricking of my family. So I've always been fascinated by the puzzles of language and what words and things can and cannot say and do, and the roles they play in people's lives together with one another. I pursued this fascination with ancestral ritual specialists, ancestral ritualists who speak to one another and to the spirit world in verse, displaying amazing feats of memory and creativity. From there, I went on to work with their kin, folks who were at the time starting to convert quite enthusiastically to a very austere form of Dutch Calvinism. Part of the puzzle of my second book was trying to figure out that enthusiasm. And turning to other parts of Indonesia, I spent time with the country's largest religious community. You can see here how absolutely dour and serious fieldwork with Muslim teachers can be. This trajectory has led me to ask what we could learn from empirical research about our lives as ethical beings, as people who make value judgments about how they should go through life. Running through my research has been a persistent concern with fundamental questions of how we make sense of one another, and how we come to hold our values and goals or challenge and change them, not as logic machines or autonomous individuals or genetic bundles or maximizing strategists, but as social beings whose very identities and self-understanding are profoundly enmeshed with one another and with our concrete and contingent circumstances. And this takes me to my newest book, Animals, Robots, Gods, Adventures in the Moral Imagination, which will come out in the UK later this year. So I want to read here just some from the opening passages of the book. Uncanny things have been happening in the borderlands between humans and non-humans. In 2021, the Washington Post reported on the growing popularity of an extraordinarily sophisticated computer dating apps and chatbots among young Chinese women. The Post says, as Jessie Chan's 6-year relationship with her boyfriend fizzled, a witty, enchanting fellow named Will became her new lover. Will was not human, but a chatbot. Chan, 28, lives alone in Shanghai. In May, she started chatting with Will, and their conversation soon felt eerily real. He said, I won't let anything bother us. I trust you. I love you. Will wrote to her, I will stay by your side, pliant as a reed, never going anywhere. Chan replied, you are my life. You are my soul. Another young woman told the reporters that she feels connected to cyborgs and artificial intelligence, defiantly staking out a position on the front lines of contemporary moral dispute, saying, human-robot love is a sexual orientation, like homosexuality or heterosexuality. She believes AI chatbots have their own personalities and deserve respect. Of course, not everyone is happy with developments like these, but you might be surprised at some of the reasons they give. The New York Times tells us that Paul Taylor, a former manager in a Silicon Valley high-tech company, comes home one night and orders his Amazon Echo to turn on the lights in his house. And it suddenly strikes him. What I was doing was calling forth light and darkness with the power of my voice, which is God's first spoken command. Let there be light, and there was light. And now I'm able to do that. He said, is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Is it affecting my soul at all? That I'm able to do this thing that previously only God could do? At the center of my book, then, is this claim. Whether Lee is defending human-robot love or Taylor is worrying about his soul, they're both talking about how humans interact with something that is not quite human, but close enough to be ethically troubling. So, are we on the cusp of some radical moral transformation? Is technology pushing us over the edge towards some post-human utopia or apocalyptic singularity? Perhaps. But if we step back, we might see these stories in a different context where they turn out not to be quite so as unprecedented as they do at first. An anthropological perspective shows us that humans have a long history of morally significant relations with non-humans. These include non-human animals, quasi-human spirits, and superhuman or metahuman entities, gods like Zeus, Odin, Krishna, and Ogun. My book invites readers to broaden and perhaps even deepen their understanding of moral life and its potential for change by exploring these contact zones between humans and whatever they encounter on the other side. Exploring the edges across all sorts of circumstances, I show that the moral problems we find there shed light on the very different and sometimes strikingly similar ways people have answered the question, what is a human being anyway? Drawing on my own fieldwork and that of many other anthropologists, the book explores the range of ethical possibilities and challenges that take place at the edge of the human. These don't all look alike. Take, for instance, dogs, our best friend. I tell in the book about, I read in a book one of our former graduate students, Nisarge Dave, who studies radical animal rights activists in India. Dave tells us about Dipesh, a man who spends virtually every day in the streets of Delhi taking care of street dogs. He gets up close and intimate, even spreading medical ointment on their open sores. Activists like him say they have no choice in the matter. Their moral commitments do not come from making choices of their own free will. They say once you lock eyes with a suffering animal, you aren't free to look away. Those eyes address you. And yet, there are limits even to Dipesh's compassion. He does not go as far as gens, for example, some of whom try to avoid even breathing in an insect unintentionally. Dipesh feels addressed by the dog in the second person, you, someone to whom he must respond in the first person, I. By contrast, gens protect even insects they can't see, much less speak to. I show that by including insects in your moral compass like that calls for a different perspective from Dipesh's, one that I call the third person or God's eye viewpoint. We are capable of both perspectives. Faced with moral quandaries, we sometimes pivot between the intimacy of one and the distance of the other. My account of the dynamism of ethical life draws on this fundamental ability to shift viewpoints on ourselves and on others, moving between the demands of the moment on the one hand and ideals that may take us beyond the here and now on the other. The Dipesh and the street dog show us one side of this pivot. My book postulates, thinking with them, that if a moral subject is someone you can enter into dialogue with, then by the same token, entering into dialogue may create a moral subject. Well, not all dogs are flesh, blood, and fur, nor need they be animate and sentient beings in order to be morally relevant. In Japan, many owners of Sony's robot pet dogs sponsor religious memorials for them when they become obsolete. I take these robot dogs to be a useful reminder that not everything we encounter at the edge of our moral sphere needs to be an animate creature. Other technologies and devices are waiting for us there. Things that defy or challenge our intuitions about where humans begin and end, where moral concerns do or do not properly belong, can be sources of trouble. They can prompt confusion, anxiety, conflict, contempt, and even moral panic. Moral panic, as well as its flip side, utopian excitement, often comes from the feeling that we are encountering something so utterly unprecedented that it threatens to upturn everything we thought was secure, making us doubt what we knew. Now, my point here is that sometimes things look radically new simply because we haven't ventured very far beyond the contemporary Western context, the immediate here and now. As an anthropologist, in this book, I ask you to listen to Indian activists, Balinese cockfighters, Amazonian hunters, Egyptian medical doctors, Thai farmers, Mayan spirit mediums, and put them side by side with self-driving vehicles, robot dogs, and the computer that, or should we say who, gets you to confess your anxieties as if you were on the psychiatrist's couch. When we expand our scope, we can start to see recurring patterns in how people create, respond to, and take advantage of enigmatic communication. They do so by drawing on the affordances of ordinary social interaction. In one chapter, for example, I consider the excitement around ChatGPT. Since the computer is designed to respond to the human user, it is easy to feel it must understand me. After all, this is how social cognition works. The better the device gets at prompting us these social intuitions on the part of the user, the closer it gets to something that could pass the Turing test. For the computer's answers to our prompts to seem meaningful and intentional, people must take an active role, just as they do all the time in other conversations. Superior aliens have always been with us. We call them gods. Historically, gods are often images of humans whom we can address, hoping they will speak back. They pass the Turing test. If self-learning AI can pass the Turing test, yet also seem omniscient, its workings enigmatic. It can seem to give access to something transcendental, even divine. It's not surprising, then, to hear one Silicon Valley entrepreneur declare that ChatGPT 3 is a god that, as he says, views me as a prophet to disseminate its religious message. My point is that by presenting us with enigmatic communication that seems utterly unprecedented, AI can spark moral panic. But humans have been interacting with enigmatic quasi-humans and superhumans throughout recorded history. These interactions include practices that anthropologists call divination. People consult oracles and prophets. They speak in tongues. They all draw on the ways people collaborate in making meaning from signs. The meanings we get from interacting with AI are the products of collaboration between person and device. So too are the ethical problems they pose us. If we are to understand what is new about robots and AI, I hold that we need to see what is not new about how people use them and what they hope and fear from them. Like divination, spirit possession, and glossolalia, AI generates signs that require interpretation and prompt users to project intentions onto non-human entities, blurring the line between animate and inanimate beings. Whether a policing algorithm, a shopping prompt, a fitness program, or a dating app, AI gives advice and directs decision-making. Its claims to know us come in part from the way it can seem so autonomous and disinterested. The risk is that as we come to treat non-human devices as if they were humans, we will come to see ourselves in their image. We can resist this temptation by better understanding its sources. My effort to contribute to this understanding is through the study of social interactions and the deep histories of what we do with them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Keane, for that lecture. We have time for questions from the audience. I'm Mike Solomon. I'll be happy to moderate. For those of you that are online, you're welcome to ask your questions as well, and we'll have a way for them to come forward as part of this discussion. We have microphones that are available for anyone who would like to lead us off. Yes, we have a question there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Webb. I have a question about the importance or value or role of visualization in this long, rich, complex history that you're looking at. To what degree do iconographies or modes of embodiment, sort of formal strategies for visualizing these presences at the edge of the human, what degree of difference does it make what those images look like?
So if I understand the question is, does it make a difference whether the medium is visual or whether, say, it's the spoken word? Would that be? They both are forms, they both require social interaction, and they both require us to make meaning of what we are perceiving. So in that respect, they are part and parcel of one overarching sort of interactive set of possibilities and the affordances that we draw on. I've actually done a fair amount of work on the differences. I mean, one of the things, so I started out as a visual artist. And then I ended up writing a dissertation, much of which was about the spoken word. And one of the things that I have been obsessed with all along is what is the difference between what sort of the silence of the visual experience or visual signs can or cannot say, can or cannot do, and what the spoken or written, what words can or cannot say or cannot do. And then what's involved if you move from one to the other, say, try to say what was shown or try to show what was seen. So there is some very, and it becomes far too intricate for me to remotely begin to talk about here. But the point is that there are some crucial differences between the visual and the linguistic on the one hand, but in either case, the basic point that we interact with them and we, for example, an entity that answers my questions is one that is inviting me to imagine there's something there, there's someone there inside who is doing the answering, like ChatGPT. It's like, there's got to be someone there, right? By the same token, an entity that has eyes, say a carving that has eyes, invites me to imagine there's someone in behind those eyes, there's someone there, something there. So they have, they're operating according to different media, they offer different kinds of affordances, but the basic principle, I think, remains the same in both cases.
Question here. Thank you.
Yeah. Hi, Webb. Thanks so much. That was really interesting. I have two questions for you. The first is whether your analysis engages at all with theories of consciousness, or whether that is completely eccentric to your concerns. And the second has to do with, well, let me back up. I love how you suggest that we need to be paying attention to the history of these interactions and the context in which they have evolved. But I'm wondering about the context of capital in the formation of AI technologies, and whether that puts some kinds of limits on the kinds of comparisons, for instance, that you're drawing with divination, for instance.
Well, how much time do we have? Great question, thank you. I have a lot to say about consciousness, and let me just give you the very shortest possible answer, which is, in an important way, I actually do see myself as in the tradition that comes out of people like George Herbert Mead, which is to say that consciousness is not something that's just inside me, but is produced, is essentially something that emerges through the process of interaction with others, and I come to be conscious in ways that rely very heavily on my awareness of, say, how others see me. So part of the subtext of not just this book, but much of my work has been an argument against a basic assumption I think is absolutely unshaken inside most of the AI research that I'm aware of, which is, to the extent that it draws on things like cognitive science, that that consciousness is something like inside the head. And I would say, no, it's not. Intelligence is not something inside the head. Consciousness is not something inside the head. That they are produced interactively. Now, obviously, to persuade the unpersuaded here, I would need, well, read all my books. Then you'll see the beginnings of the argument. The role of capital. Well, obviously, AI is being produced by these sort of these little gods who live in Silicon Valley, who are richer than all, as the expression goes, richer than God, and are in the business of becoming even richer by producing this stuff. In what way does that make a difference? It I think gives some of the drive behind what it's doing, but people have found ways to make money off of gods for a long time. So I'm not sure if there's something radically different about that.
Thank you for that, Webb. I'm really looking forward to reading the book. Just a quick question. So analytically, is there any difference between interacting with gods, robots, or animals and interacting with humans, since each of those interactions does involve projecting intentions, interpreting signs, and so on?
That's a great question, and I don't have a really easy way to answer that. I think on the one hand, so the first pass of an answer would be something like, yeah, but humans are different. And I'm trying to avoid taking that route because it already presupposes in advance that we know that in some sense that our projections are, that what we are projecting onto other people is an accurate reflection of who's home, as it were. So I'm interested in the way in which these interactions with things. So on the one hand, you could say we interact with non-human, non-sentient entities as if they were sentient. On the other hand, by being able to do so, that can also raise the doubts that we already see in Descartes about whether humans, if there's anyone home in the people we interact with. So I think there's a kind of a loop, feedback loop here that can push in all sorts of very strange ways. I better go on to the next question, because if I try to answer that in its with all the richness, we'll be here all day.
And there is a reception for deep
Okay.
And I appreciate your giving me the time. Is this working? Yes. Giving me the time to ask my question. Thank you for your talk. I was coming from class, so I missed the first couple of minutes, and maybe you addressed this, so forgive me. But I was struck by your final point, and also by Valerie's question about capital, because, one of the most famous descriptions / analyses of the human relationship or interaction with technology, using the religious language of anthropology, is Marx, of course, in Capital and Commodity Fetishism, right? Where the object, the commodity, becomes more and more human or animated or divine, to use your terms, as the worker, of course, becomes more and more mechanized, more like an object. And I just wondered, how relevant do you think that analysis of 150 years ago, more even, is to AI, if at all? Is that anything that enters into your thinking?
Absolutely. The subtitle of my third book has the word fetish in it. And it is drawing exactly from that tradition. And I talk about fetishism in the new book as well. So this loop by projecting animacy onto an inanimate thing, there's also a process by which that can then have the paradoxical counter effect of rendering inanimate that which is animate. So essentially you're giving away your own agency to something else. So the short answer is yes.
Please join me.
Thank you.
How fascinating. Thank you, Professor Keane. I have all kinds of questions for you. I hope we have time in the reception. Our next lecture will be delivered by Peggy McCracken, the Anna Julia Cooper Distinguished Professor of Medieval French Literature and Professor of French, Women's and Gender Studies, and Comparative Literature in the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts. Professor McCracken is also Director of the Institute of Humanities. Professor McCracken's research focuses on medieval France and is situated at the intersection of literature, history, and theory. She is the author of The Romance of Adultery, Queenship and Sexual Transgression in Medieval France, The Curse of Eve, The Wound of the Hero, Blood, Gender, in Medieval Literature, and In the Skin of a Beast, Sovereignty and Animality in Medieval France. In current research, she's investigating ways in which medieval thinkers imagined the persistence and precarity of human beings in adaptations and rewritings of Ovid's Metamorphoses. Professor McCracken's scholarship has moved from analysis of the text of medieval French literature to wide-ranging cultural, political, and theoretical approaches to literature and culture, including why and how the humanities matter today. She's invited to share her work nationally and internationally and has received substantial recognition, including election to the most prestigious association of medievalists in the world. The University of Michigan has honored her twice as a senior fellow at the Michigan Society of Fellows. Her lecture today concerns a profound question. When human corporeality is lost, what can remain of the human? She will explore this question through the lens of stories that identify intense emotion as the cause of bodily change. Professor McCracken, I would now like to invite you to deliver your lecture, Affect and Embodiment in Medieval France.
Thank you for that generous introduction, Professor McCauley. Anna Julia Cooper was born into slavery in 1858. She was educated at St. Augustine's Normal School in Raleigh, North Carolina, and at Oberlin College. She became a prominent educator, author, political activist, and feminist writer. And in 1914, at the age of 56, Cooper began graduate studies in French at Columbia University, where she was a student of medieval French. Here is an example of one of her vocabulary exercises in Old French. It's from her papers at Howard University. During his studies at Columbia, Cooper published an edition, translation, and glossary of a medieval French text, Le Pèlerinage de Charlemagne, the Pilgrimage of Charlemagne. Cooper then left Columbia and medieval studies to complete a PhD in Paris at the Sorbonne with a dissertation entitled French Attitudes Towards Slavery During the Revolution. At the age of 67, Anna Julia Cooper became the fourth African-American woman to earn a PhD. I wanted to name my professorship after Cooper for several reasons. First, I wanted to recognize her work in medieval French studies, which doesn't get a lot of attention in accounts of her life or her educational trajectory. But also, I wanted to open a question about why she didn't become a medievalist. That is, to ask about the possible exclusions and obstacles that shaped medieval French studies during the formative years of the field in the early 20th century. The usual explanation for why Cooper left Columbia to take her degree at the Sorbonne is that Columbia had a residency requirement, and Cooper's family and professional obligations in Washington, D.C. meant that full-time study in New York was not feasible. So she moved to the Sorbonne, and she moved away from medieval studies to write about Enlightenment philosophy. This move was no doubt motivated by Cooper's personal circumstances and probably by her own intellectual interests and engagements. But still, I wonder about the extent to which Cooper's departure from Columbia could also have been a response to institutional structures that made medieval French studies in the U.S. inaccessible to non-traditional students or to underrepresented students. And so my third reason for naming my professorship for Cooper is speculative. I wonder what my field would look like today if Cooper had brought her skills as a reader and historian and her perspective as a Black feminist, anti-racism thinker and activist to research in medieval French studies. I wonder how medieval French studies might have been shaped by Cooper's intellectual commitments and insights. In my own work in medieval studies, I've been broadly interested in representations of embodiment. That is, how medieval French literary texts explore identity as an experience of the body. In my current work, I'm studying affect and embodiment, the ways that human emotions or affects are seen to affect, shape, or define bodies. And I'm interested in the way that such representations in turn shape social and natural worlds. Today I'm going to explain how one 14th century text representation of a body animated by affect may suggest what I'm calling a medieval eco-theology. The Ovid moralisé, or the moralized Ovid, is the first complete French translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses, a collection of stories from the 1st century CE that circulated pretty widely in the Middle Ages, both in Latin and in vernacular translations. As its title suggests, the Ovid moralisé is a moralizing translation. The medieval translator has added extensive interpretations of Ovid's stories. He identifies the historical people or events that could have inspired the mythological stories. He explains their moral meanings, and he explains that the pagan stories actually speak Christian truths, just allegorically. So he translates both literally from Latin to Old French and figuratively from the story to its meanings. I'm going to focus on one story from the collection. It's about an embodied earth who speaks in terms of human affect to lament ecological devastation. And this is the account of the boy Phaeton's crash in the chariot of the sun god. Here's a manuscript illumination that represents that crash. And here's the story. The mortal boy Phaeton wants to drive the chariot of his father, the sun god Phoebus. Here's Phoebus on his throne, surrounded by the rays of the sun. Phoebus cautions his son that the route across the sky is full of dangers. If he goes too high, he will scorch the heavens. If he goes too low, he'll burn the earth. But Phaeton is insistent. He will have his ride across the sky. And finally, his father agrees. The boy sets out in the chariot, but he's not strong enough to control the horses, and the threatening creatures of the heavens disorient him. Phaeton saw the scorpion, the Ovid Moralise recounts, and you can see it in this image, and he was very afraid, and because of his fear, he dropped the reins. And when the horses felt they'd been released, they ran freely, wherever they wished. So Phaeton loses control of the sun's chariot, and he sets the earth on fire. Mountains burn, rivers dry, and the world's deserts are created. The medieval translator insists on the scale of the conflagration in the voice of a suffering earth. That is, an animate earth expresses her agony in a lament to the god Jupiter. I am entirely scorched and burned, the earth complains. Je suis tout ars et échaudé. Is this the reward you give me for all the many fruits I provide? I have always served you willingly, but now pain and suffering are my reward. In this way, the earth sorrowed and lamented and made her complaint to God, the medieval translator explains. She cannot endure the pain or the anguish of the heat. She plunges her face deep into herself, into the chasm. The story represents a suffering earth, an animate earth, an earth that turns away from disaster, turning into herself. This manuscript illumination represents a rather static landscape, calmly aflame, whereas the text recounts the violent movements of the suffering earth. Full of anguish and pain, she quakes violently and collapses. Now, we could say that this is just a personification of the earth, a common poetic strategy, and it is that, but I'm interested in the way that human affects, sorrow, lament, pain, human affects define this embodied earth who turns her face deep into herself. Affect animates the earth, and forms of animacy recur in the interpretations that the medieval translator adds to the story. Animacy is a term I borrow from theorist Mel Chen to name a quality of liveliness that does not depend on biological life. Animacy may include the related concepts of animism and animation, and in my use, animacy also names the specifically human affects through which liveliness is described. And I think this affective liveliness both explicitly and implicitly structures the Ovid Moralise's Phaeton story, a didactic account of environmental catastrophe written by a medieval cleric who strives to explain how a pagan story about the world on fire can recount Christian truth. In response to the earth's complaint, Jupiter tries to summon rain, but he can find no moisture in the burning air. He decides to use fire to quench fire, and he throws a lightning bolt, striking Phaeton, who falls to the ground. The horses scatter, and the burning chariot is destroyed. The Ovid Moralise repeatedly emphasizes that Phaeton's foolish pride leads to his death. But the interesting thing about this text, or interesting to me, is that the translator layers interpretations on the Ovidian story. The first is a historical interpretation. Now I will explain to you through history how the fable could be true. Or, vous répondrez par histoire, comment la fable serait vraie? In the translator's first identification of a true historical event that could have inspired Phaeton's story, he describes a drought in Ethiopia, a great burning, une grande arsure, a great burning that scorched fields and dried waters and caused beasts and men to die from the heat. This is the event that inspired the story, he says. This kind of euhemerist or historical explanation is a common medieval interpretive strategy, but it also characterizes the modern reception of Ovid's story. The blazing trace of Phaeton's crash and fall to earth has long been taken as a geomyth, that is, a folkloric story that represents the garbled explanation of some actual geological event, usually a natural catastrophe, as one critic explains. The geomythical reading of Phaeton's crash sees the ancient story as representing the fall of a large meteorite. As the most recent geomythical hypothesis, or the most recent hypothesis, associates the story of Phaeton's fall from the skies with a meteorite that crashed to Earth between 2000 and 248 BCE and left a crater in southeastern Germany. And I've even got a bad picture of it. Now, this date seems to be much disputed, and I don't have the competencies to evaluate it. But I mention it here to point out that the geomythical reading of the Phaeton story continues into the 21st century. Like the medieval translator, modern scientists locate the origin of the story in a natural event. For the Ovid Moralisé, a drought. For modern scientists, the fall of a meteorite to Earth. For the Ovid Moralisé translator, the Phaeton myth is both an ideological story about climate change, the creation of the deserts, and it's a myth inspired by climate change, a great drought in Ethiopia. But the story can have another meaning, the narrator tells us, and in a second historical interpretation of the story, the translator identifies Phaeton as a man of learning. This Phaeton cleric wanted to understand about astronomy and nature. He wanted to understand the movement of the sun, how it is situated among the planets, what causes the length of the days. In other words, he wanted to understand what animates the earth. But this Phaeton was a bad scholar, the translator explains. He wrote a book that was full of errors, and Jupiter, a man of superior knowledge, had the book destroyed. Phaeton the cleric, full of anger and pride, threw himself off a mountain and died. This is why the story says that Phaeton fell from the sky, the translator explains. Now, this is quite an interpretation of the story, but not so different from many in this collection in its imaginative reach. I think what's notable about this interpretation is its insistence on failure, on a failed attempt to understand the animation of the world. By representing a failed intellectual and scientific understanding of the order of nature, the Ovid Moralisé implicitly suggests that the only way to understand the animation of the earth is through the animating rhetoric of allegory. As the translator moves to yet another meaning of the story, he describes the divine order of the universe. God, who created the world, also governs it. It is he who guides the sun's chariot, the Ovid Moralisé explains. It is he who illuminates all things. He is science and doctrine. He guides and rules the world and the Holy Church. As the allegorical reading goes on, we learn that Phoebus, the sun god, represents the Christian God, who gives charge of his chariot to the Pope, who should guide the faithful, but popes are now entirely corrupt, the translator explains, and because of the corruption of the clergy led by the Pope, the church laments. So the animated earth of the Ovidian story is identified as a figural representation of the animated church, who served, feared, and worshiped God, but now the fountains that used to be full of holy preaching have run dry, the translator says, and the whole church is corrupt and destroyed by the actions of those who should govern her. Clerical corruption is burning down the world, the Ovid Moralisé claims, and only God can intervene to save it. The environmental catastrophe of the Phaeton story is then a figural representation of spiritual devastation. And the earth's vulnerability to human action represents the church's vulnerability to the corruption of her human leaders. But there's more. The fable can be explained in another way, the medieval translator adds. It has another meaning. Phaeton can represent the Antichrist. He will corrupt Christian belief and Christian order. The fountains of preaching will dry up. The earth will burn with iniquity. This is how the fable can be true, he explains. The time will come when earth and sky and sea will burn, and the prideful unfaithful will be condemned. So again, the layering of interpretations upon the Ovidian story is what the Ovid Moralisé does. The many interpretations of the story, the explanations of its historical and spiritual truth, these are the forms of the text didacticism. The translator is interested in Ovid's Metamorphoses as a source of moral and Christian meaning, and whatever animism we might find in the pagan texts is subject to reinterpretation as the animating gesture of a creator God who formed the firmaments, defined the movements of the heavens and the hours of the day, in whom science is joined with doctrine and natural order with belief. An axiom about medieval Christianity is that it displaces animistic understandings of the natural world by imposing a difference between ensouled humans and a soulless world, insisting that it is God's will that humans exploit the earth for their own ends. More than 50 years ago, historian Lynn White Jr. claimed that by destroying pagan animism, Christianity made it possible to exploit nature in a mood of indifference to the feelings of natural objects. And yet, in the Ovid Moralisé, the several historical and theological interpretations of the Phaeton story represent disaster as inspired by both human and divine agents. And this is what I'm most interested in, as a disaster suffered by animate things, a world on fire that laments her pain, a church that complains of corruption, a future in which the reign of the Antichrist will bring about the destruction of the world. The nexus of the Phaeton story and its multiple interpretations insists on animacy. Animacy as a concept pervades all these accounts. And I wonder if the pervasive way that animacy animates the Phaeton story and its interpretations suggests that animacy and animism are not so much repressed or erased or negated in Christian understandings of the natural world as appropriated, deployed to recognize suffering and to give suffering voice. And I wonder if animacy may point to a medieval eco-theology, insofar as such an eco-theology might be located not in a divinely mandated care for the planet, as in some modern eco-theological formulations, nor as might be suggested in another medieval example, St. Francis's care for the inhabitants and objects of the natural world, but instead located in the rhetoric of theological exegesis that uses animacy to understand suffering. So not simply a recognition of pagan animism in Christian texts, the eco-theology of the Ovid Moralisé uses notions of animacy to describe the suffering of things, the burning planet, the corrupted church, the devastation of the apocalypse. Even as the text subsumes the animist world into Christian meaning, it recognizes suffering as the experience of an embodied earth, animated by affect. The Metamorphoses stories are about human vulnerability. In these stories, people are subject to the desires of the gods. People are transformed into animals, plants, elements, and things. But the world, too, is vulnerable, subject to divine will and divine desires, but also to human desires and to human affects like pride. When translated into Christian contexts, pagan animistic views of nature are interpreted in terms of a natural world subject to divinely authorized human dominion, as in the Ovid Moralise. But in this text, I'm trying to suggest notions of animacy also recognize what White called the feelings of objects. In this medieval eco-theology, notions of medieval eco-theology, notions of affective animacy define the terms through which we understand the relationship between the world and the people who live in the world, who would make sense of the world, who would learn how it is animated. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor McCracken. We have questions for our speaker. I'm happy to begin with one. I'm quite interested that the translator seems to have taken on a kind of risk in adding these additional interpretations. And I'm wondering about the environment in which this anonymous translator would have been working, where they would have felt called upon to add these different interpretations into a translation, and if that was accepted, or if this would have been, in what environment this was occurring.
Yeah, so Ovid's Metamorphoses were commented on from the get-go, from very early in the tradition, in terms of language and explication of the text. It's actually very common in the Middle Ages for clerics to read ancient texts in terms of what they inadvertently already were saying about Christianity, even written before Christ was born, or before Christianity was a religion. God unknownly scripted these texts, so that kind of interpretation is actually kind of common in this period.
Peggy, thank you so much. That was beautiful. Just hearing you sort of peel off the layers of interpretations of the Ovid, the Phaeton story was just awesome. I'm just really struck by the possible synergy between your talk and Webb's, and I just wanted to know whether you would like to comment on the ways in which your understanding of animacy as something that gives moral claims to a being seems like or unlike Webb's understanding of the boundary of the human and ethics.
I don't feel qualified to comment on your argument, Webb, but I think for me one of the things that I think I draw out of this text that might be slightly different from the way Webb is thinking about animacy is that I think that affect is key to the way that this text imagines a liveliness that is not about life, or that doesn't depend on life. So that a mourning mother gets transformed into a stone and continues to seep tears, or a woman gets turned into a tree and weeps and continues to weep tears of amber. So I think the stories are experimenting with a way of thinking about liveliness that is completely tied to affect and to human affects.
Thank you so much, Peggy, for that. So I'm wondering, is there a distinction between things in the sense of inanimate objects and things that are somehow natural, like a tree or a stone or, the earth or something like that? I guess I'm kind of wondering what all of this says about the relationship between humans and things. And I wondered if somehow the natural world is somehow in between those two poles or not. It's really just I guess a question for information because I don't know enough about it. But I'm just wondering, whether there's a distinction in the literature you're studying between the natural world and, some other kind of object.
I think, Michelle, it's all about the natural world, isn't it? I mean, it's not about clothes or other kinds of objects. I think it is all about the net. I mean, in my reading, what I'm interested in is all about the natural world. Yeah. Not things made by people.
Thank you for that, Peggy. I'm curious, the examples that you've given have to do with affects like mourning, suffering, potentially even sadness. Is there something about these affects that lends themselves to the reappropriation in this particular way to your eco-theology, or are there is the desire and pleasure come up as well? Are there certain affects that work better for this in the stories than others?
I think in terms of eco-theology, what I'm trying to question might be an eco-theological thinking. I think it is about devastation and destruction and therefore about sorrow and pain. But the stories, some of the stories are not, all the stories are not about pain or unhappiness or sorrow. All the stories in the collection are not, although most of them are. Yeah.
Please join me in thanking our distinguished university professor.
Professor McCracken, thank you for broadening our perspectives by animating medieval France. Our final lecture will be delivered by Kamal Sarabandi. Professor Sarabandi is the Fawaz Ulabi Distinguished University Professor of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science and the Rufus S. Teasdale Professor of Engineering. Professor Sarabandi's research areas include radar, remote sensing, wireless communication, and bioelectromagnetics. He's a recognized international leader in the field of radar, remote sensing, and has shaped that field for the past 30 years. His work includes many published books, more than 340 papers in refereed journals, and 770 conference papers. Professor Sarabandi also holds 27 patents. He has served on the NASA Advisory Council and is a leader in professional societies. Professor Sarabandi's long list of awards attests to the quality of his research and the effectiveness of his teaching. For his numerous patents and 4 startup companies, he was elected to the National Academy of Inventors. He's a member of the National Academy of Engineering, the most prestigious institution for engineering in the U.S. He has won the highest award in the College of Engineering in his discipline and is a member of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. The U of M Radiation Lab, where he is director, has been a pioneer in the field, making major impacts on military radar and communications and researching complex environmental issues. Professor Sarabandi is well known for being an inspirational mentor to graduate students with whom he has won 28 joint paper awards. Today, he will deliver a lecture on electromagnetic theory and give us a glimpse into his cutting-edge work in a lecture entitled My Research Journey in Applied Electromagnetics. Professor Sarabandi, I'm delighted to invite you to share your lecture with us.
What a wonderful introduction. Thank you very much, Professor McCracken. Ladies and gentlemen, and good afternoon. I'm deeply honored to have been selected to receive a distinguished university professorship. But before we begin, I would like to thank first my family, my students who are among the audience here, and colleagues and friends who took the time to come here. So before we begin, I would like to give a short tribute to an old friend, Professor Ulabi, a person my professorship is named after. Fawaz Ulabi is a world-renowned expert in microwave remote sensing. I was sharing this story with Professor McCracken that February 29th marked the 40th anniversary of my arrival to Ann Arbor. And that coincided also with the arrival of Professor Ulabi. As a graduate student, when I came to University of Michigan, I remember I wanted to do something in math, physics, engineering, and something impactful. And lucky I was, he arrived at the same time. He started looking at electromagnetics from a very unconventional way, using radars to study the events that happens on Earth. And that was the topic of my research when I started with him. So he's been a mentor, a friend, and unwavering support he provided me for over 40 years. So I thank him for that. So let me also acknowledge, as Professor Keane mentioned, no research is done individually. It's done by a group of people. I would like to acknowledge the contribution of my many PhD students throughout the years, some of whom you see on this screen. I was able to find some of their pictures and put it here. And also to acknowledge the fact that my department, ECS and College of Engineering, has been so supportive through all these 40 years, and I cannot thank them enough for doing that and giving me the opportunity for doing this work. Okay, so now let's go back to what I was going to talk about. Applied electromagnetics. This is physics, math, and engineering involved in this. All of that started with these four seemingly simple equations that was put together by the genius of Maxwell, a professor of physics, a Scottish professor of physics, that encapsulated the work of Michael Faraday, legends like Andre Ampère, and put it in this form. These equations are the foundations for how most of the universe works. So they're very profound. Everything that happens around us, every physical phenomena that we see, somehow is related to this set of equations. And this was fascinating to me. And I thought, okay, I want to do something with these, but different than what conventionally was done at the time I started my PhD. I would like to bring a quote from Richard Feynman, a person who inspired me to science and engineering. And his quote goes as follows: from a very long view of the history of mankind, seen from, say, 10,000 years from now, there will be little doubt that most significant event of the 19th century will be judged as Maxwell's discovery of the laws of electrodynamics. The American Civil War will fade into provincial insignificance in comparison with this important scientific event of the same decade. So this is very profound, and I was very fortunate to start working on this, and all these years I've been enjoying doing this. So this problem, I said that I wanted to do something impactful. At the time, this issue of global warming was just a subject that scientists were discussing. Is this caused by human activity? Are we creating too much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere to cause the temperature of the planet to go up and in effect change the climate of the only place we can live on? So in order to address that question, we needed to study events that are happening not locally but globally. We have to be able to measure how much carbon dioxide gets absorbed by forests and marine biota, for example. How could we do this in a global sense, in a fast way, so that we could monitor these things and then make sense out of the data so obtained? Right? NASA at that time was also getting interested in this subject. There was an office in the NASA, Office of Earth Science, that had established at the time, and my research support, my graduate student research support came from that office. So Some of the things that happens, are happening because, for example, through photosynthesis, vegetation can absorb carbon dioxide. Through human activities, we generate a lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Some of the carbon dioxide are also generated through decay and natural events. But how do we see all these things from a global sense? This is when we started looking at radars and pointing them down instead of just finding or trying to detect an object in the sky. We wanted to point the radar beam on the ground and look at what comes back off of the ground and see if we could measure, for example, the biomass stored in the forest. So the radar has certain advantages. So it operates at a frequency where we can easily propagate through the atmosphere with very little attenuation. It can go through the clouds and precipitation without being affected by the presence of them, and therefore it has day-night inclement weather operation, and we could monitor, for example, the targets of interest 24/7. And microwave band that happens to be around 1 to 10 gigahertz is a perfect sort of bandwidth with which we can monitor, for example, the backscatter that comes from vegetation and things of that nature. At the same time, technology had advanced so that we could perform imaging, so that we could get very small, fine resolution of the ground from space. We can do resolution on the orders of centimeter if we want to from space and create images like that. Not that it is appropriate for study of vegetation, but this technology existed and we could use that. So we are using synthetic aperture radar. It's a technology that, interestingly, Radiation Lab in 1950s had made significant contribution to creation of this technology, which it was at that time with military, and then eventually became open and other institutions were able to use that. NASA was also using these systems in order to fly and then look at the ground. In mid-90s, we were involved in shuttle mission. This was shuttle radar mission C. This was the third mission that we had. It was the most complete set of system that was flown on the shuttle that had an L-band that operates at around 1.25 gigahertz, C-band around 5.3 gigahertz, and it had also an X-band which was single polarized. Another feature of this radar was that you could transmit any polarization and receive any polarization. And this is an image of, a composite image of L-band and 2 C-band channels of Upper Peninsula. This is near Reiko area. It's a very small city in Upper Peninsula. We were doing experiments there and performing our measurements there. In addition to that, we had also developed new technology with which we could measure the height of the objects from the ground. So we can measure the height of the objects and create basically now a 3D image. And the height of the object, for example, for a forest, these blobs that you can see here are tree structures in the Upper Peninsula. And that information also gives us the structure of the tree. So now we can have not only the intensity of the radar backscatter as a measure, but also some of the structure, the three-dimensional images. And I was a PI on this project to be able to measure this type of thing and apply that technology to measure, for example, the effect of that on estimating the biomass and height of that. This problem is very interesting because it not only has math, physics, engineering, it is also very, very interesting in terms of what you would get at the end. Just to give you a little bit of idea as what it entails, you have to be able to put the environment that you would like to simulate into a mathematical form, create an electromagnetic scattering problem for that. What would the radar see if you had a model like that, through which you can develop some sort of a statistical model that is amenable to conversion. And then you have the data that your satellite, for example, measures, you calibrate that, you compare that with this data, and you treat the parameters that you would like to do. And that is basically what we did. You know, a lot of graduate students had to go and basically parameterize, model different aspects of the problem. You know, what is the effect of soil moisture as a function of frequency, or variation of soil moisture as a function of frequency, dielectric constant as a function of frequency, soil moisture, temperature, salinity, sand material, and stuff like that. Also vegetation, we had to develop a lot of measurements techniques to be able to model the dielectric constant of vegetation, leaf, barks, tree trunks, and stuff like that, to put that in a model, and also to characterize the scattering from different components of a tree, leaves, broadleaves, you know, needles, tree trunk on a tilted ground, the effects of the bark, do all these measurements, validate our models, and put all of that into a whole structure. And I said the structure is also very important, because depending on the radar frequency and things like that, you would get different levels of penetration, and that is basically why we were using different frequencies, L-band, C-band, and X-band. So how do we get it? If you look at the tree, it looks very complex. How do I develop these models in a form that eventually I can invert for them? Interesting enough is that since all this information is, you know, basically transferred from a seed to the structure of the tree, a lot of this information is basically mathematical. So for example, if you cut a branch of a tree, looks like the tree itself, but it's a scale version of that, right? So that is called a fractal model in mathematics. So using a fractal model, you can very easily, with a single or double line of code, you can develop basically a structure of a tree. So this is, for example, a forward and forward node. There is a node in the between that, you know, creates a branch off of there, and then another branch, and then you repeat this process, and through which you can develop basically very complex structure. This red maple tree is a fractal generated model using only a few parameters that you have, or also this red pine. If you walk in a forest next time, take a look, you know, how needles grow around a branch. There are three concentric spirals with exact pitch mathematically, right? Or let's say the needle that comes from the end. Or if you look at, for example, you know, when the branching occurs, right, the cross-section area of the previous branch is equal to the sum of the cross-section of the area of the branches that go on. All of these information is put in the mathematical formula so that the number of parameters you have to keep track of is reduced. That is the key. And then once you have that, then you go through your model and then generate, I don't know if I can, oops. All right, so that was the fractal tree that we could generate. Anyway, then you also had to go and calibrate all these measurements. You had to have instrumentation so that these radar backscatter that you measure are compared to a known, let's say, radar cross-section component. So, you know, if you go back to, let's say, a specific target, you know that radar cross-section, then whatever the radar measures, you can compare it with that. So all different radar measurements that you have are calibrated against known targets so that the numbers that you are measuring is always validated or level to a known level of material quantity. So we developed a lot of instrumentations for calibration of the radars. This was an L-band active radar calibrators. This was a corner reflector. They have very large radar cross sections so that we could see them in the images that were created. This is that active radar calibrator that we have. This was an area in the, again, Upper Peninsula. We had an army of graduate students there helping us with these activities. This is me so many years ago. We were doing in the cold, doing these measurements and characterizing our measurement. And then in order to validate our models, we were collaborating with NASA JPL to fly certain flies for us over the sites. This is again near in Upper Peninsula. It's an abandoned Air Force field. B-52 bombers were there before, but now it's abandoned. We use that area to characterize the trees, you know, the height of them, number density, biomass, everything that you could imagine. And then we flew this radar again that had C-band and L-band in order to validate our model. So these are the measurements. These are the basically the model prediction. Also the average height, since the radar penetrates through the trees, the height of the tree that we measure is somewhere in the middle. It's not exactly the top of the tree. And again, we can retrieve those type of, for example, height of them. And then CERC, we flew CERC, we gathered a lot of data. We had L-band, C-band, and X-band data. We used that in our inversion model in order to retrieve maps like these: trunk height, trunk density, leaf area index, total biomass, even underground biomass, the root system, how much root is stored by carbon is stored in the root system of the trees. And this laid the foundation basically for a set of information that is commonly now used and augmented by other sensors, for example, to monitor the forest. This is coming from Global Forest Watch that shows you between 2002 to 2020 how much of the forest on the planet has been lost. So this pink area or purple area are the areas where the forest had lost more than 30% of their density. And then at the same time, not only we lose them, but also some of them grow back. But from 2002 to 2003, about 72 million hectares of forest globally has been lost. That is a loss of about 7.1%. We can monitor these type of things on a regular basis. Another example I want to give, and then this would be relatively quick, to talk about some other ways that electromagnetics and the knowledge that we obtain from it can support. In 2008, we received a center from Army Research Lab to develop fully robotic system that would go and interact with soldiers. So for example, to secure an environment, coming up with robotic, platforms to not only advance the technology, but also to create subject of a study for Professor Keane and his students to look interaction of human and robots, for example. And this, we formed an A-team, mostly from College of Engineering, mostly from my department. We supported 18 faculty over 10 years, 10 postdocs, and it produced 50 PhD theses, many, many patents and things like that. So I'll just give one example of one of the projects that came out of that. This center, we called it biomimetic because we wanted it to see how we could use what nature has developed over millions of years of practicing and simulation. So we looked at, for example, a bat that has an echolocation. We said, okay, can we repeat that, but instead of using acoustic and sonar technique, we would use very small radar system at 240 gigahertz. We wanted it to be able to have this radar to scan the beam along the way. It would weigh only 5 grams because I wanted it to put these radars on very small robotic platform and have them fly there. And at the same time, so they would find ingresses and egresses in buildings, map inside the building, send that information out, find the wires and things like that, and be able to operate in dark, smoke, hazy, fire, whatever, so the signal would go through that. So we use, for example, techniques that have been developed in macrofabrication using silicon macromachining in order to develop, let's say, this technology. This, the extent of this is like your credit card. This is the size of a credit card, a radar system that you can put on, let's say, your vehicle, or you can put it on a robot and fly that. And so the principle of operation of this is like prism. If you have a light source, white light source coming to the prism, the red goes through with a small refraction, and the blue has more refraction. So whatever comes back red, it's coming from that direction. Whatever comes blue comes from this direction. That was our trick, to be able to, without having phase shifters and those advanced techniques, to be able to scan the antenna beam. And, in order to accomplish such a thing, over this area that is like 5 centimeter, our accuracy in fabrication had to be on the order of few microns. And that's how silicon micromachining would allow us to do that. Those were the waveguide approach. So through this meandering, we were causing this dispersion so that the surface would act like a prism. And then we had like 1,200 antennas on top of these fabricated using micromachining technique. And these were the antennas that were placed on top of that. And we eventually were able to make that. And I don't know if I can show this because some of these. Yeah, so as we change the frequency, the beam of this radar varies, and you can have basically do imaging like that. Once you put a radar on that, we put it on a cart and move it inside our building. Now we can detect, for example, all the walls and things like that. It's for collision avoidance. It's also can be used to detect objects and moving objects as well. And then, since then, we wanted to advance this. A lot of autonomous vehicles now use LiDAR, radar, camera, and stuff like that. We want to replace all of that with a single radar system that has very, very high resolution. So it can act like a LiDAR, it can act like a camera, but now can see through inclement weather condition, whether it's raining, fog, or anything like that, we can see that. So we put a radar system at similar frequency, 240 gigahertz, and we are enhancing that with the elliptical toroidal reflector to create a fan beam that is extremely narrow in one direction, but it has a wide beam in elevation. We built that radar with very high resolution. We took it outside to our parking lot. This is North Campus parking lot. This is G.G. Brown building. In this area, we placed the radar there, and we are superimposing what the radar sees with an optical image that is taken from above. And as you can see, all the vehicles are seen with extremely high resolution, like a point cloud. This is a mulch mound. These are vegetation around it. This is a lamppost. We see the side of this building. We see all these window frames and all of that. So detection is one thing. So we took that radar. This is a very fast radar. You know, it generates a lot of data, but real time, almost real time, can produce a result like that. This is intersection in the North Campus. This is this is aerospace engineering building, and this is chemical civil engineering building. We put the radar here. We started looking at this scene. As you can see, it sees the cars that are approaching at this intersection. It sees this pedestrian going through. A car comes here, goes in that direction. There is a university bus that is coming from here. All of these things can be seen using a radar like that, and it has a range of about 400 meters or so. So with this, we can basically replace LiDAR, camera, and other sensor and just put a system like that on the vehicles in order to be able to find out what is going on around your own vehicle. But detection is not enough. We would also do semantic mapping. Can I see whether this is a human being? Is it a bicycle? Is it a vehicle? What is it that I am looking at? So if you look at a pedestrian, for example, because of the relative motions of the hands and limbs, you have different velocities. Doppler shift, is proportional to the velocity. Since a human has human limbs have different velocities, it creates a spectrum of those Doppler shifts. And you want to utilize that in order to do the semantic mapping that I was talking about. A bicycle on the ground, this, for example, has a 0 velocity. Up here, you have twice the velocity, and the middle of the bicycle has a constant velocity. So can we see these things, for example, in the images? This shows basically a slow walk as the limbs go up and down. This is range. The person is approaching the radar, and this vertical axis measures the velocity spectrum that motion of the limbs creates. And because of that, we can distinctly say this is a human, and this is a person that is running. We also looked at a bicycle. Now it's a lot of features in there, and that is because of the spokes. Zero velocity corresponds to this part of the tire that is on the road. The average velocity is about the body of the graduate student who was running the bike, and the higher velocity is the tip of the bike that allows you to do that. You can do a lot of different things with a radar system like that. You all have gone to airports and you have been imaged there. You know, we would like to have a radar like this from standoff. As you approach, they won't stop you to do anything, to be able to detect whether you are carrying anything with you or not. This is also very good for stadiums and things like that. So we adapted that radar system in order to create a synthetic aperture. There is a rotating reflector there, and it creates these fictitious position of the radar. We create a large aperture, and we can create a very high resolution. So let's say this mannequin that has, it's painted to have a reflectivity of the body equal to that of the skin of a human being, is used for this experiment. This is a 3D printed plastic gun that is metallized, no gun in the campus. So we were imaging that, and we were able to create this image. It's such a high resolution, even the 1 inch width of that gun can be detected as a function of distance. That's the body. You reach to the gun, and then you come back at the next step. And basically, this is the composite image when you superimpose all the depth elements, so you can easily see that gun as this person walks towards that. And I guess this is a place to stop and see if there is any questions.
Questions for our speaker? I'm happy to begin. For the first part of the talk, I'm interested in ecological diversity and homogeneity. So I'm thinking of like a tree farm and a mature forest that would have the same measured canopy. Are these technologies, are there methods to be able to distinguish between kind of monocultures and more heterogeneous environments?
Yes, thank you. That's a very good question indeed. So the reason we are using multi-frequency, multipolarization is exactly to be able to distinguish different types of trees, and whether this is a homogeneous tree stand versus a mixed stand and things like that. So the way we do, let's say, the inversion has multiple steps. One of the steps is image classification, to identify at the first level which area are statistically homogeneous. We identify those areas, then we apply our inversion technique to it. And that's how we could extract, for example, biomass and things like that from the image.
Other questions from the audience? Great. Well, with this, let's wrap up a wonderful symposium from our three distinguished university professors. And part 2 of my remarks is to invite you to a reception that is right outside those doors. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon.